All right, welcome to Now This Is Podcasting. I'm your host, Connor, and I'm here as always with Calvin.
Thanks for having me.
And we're doing something a little different today. Tragedy of Macbeth came out the tail end of 2021, and I thought it'd be kind of interesting to do like a compare and contrast. This is a story that I think is like pretty well known, so we're also going to compare it to Macbeth that came out in 2015, which stars Michael Fassbender. So I think this will be kind of a fun episode. We haven't really done something quite like this before, but these movies are so different, yet they're the same story. I think it makes it kind of fascinating to talk about. So I just kind of want to give a brief synopsis on Macbeth. He meets these three witches who foretell that he'll become the King of Scotland. He's then kind of encouraged by his wife even to take on that mantle himself. They conspire to kill the king. He then begins to kind of lose touch with reality, and he becomes paranoid that he'll lose his position. This leads to him having his close friend murdered, and it leads to civil war in Scotland. He, of course, eventually loses his kingdom, as predicted by these witches, and that's essentially the tragedy of Macbeth. And so we're going to explore that more through these like two different films.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that we have two different films going in two different directions, and I think the reason is that Macbeth is a tragedy in two main ways. It's a tragedy of mind and a tragedy of body. And what I mean by that is a tragedy of mind in that it's a man trying to fight against fate. And he fights in a way against for the fate that he wants and against the fate he doesn't want in the cosmic silliness that is man. But it's also another way of thinking of it as a tragedy of mind is were the voices of the witches like his own inner desires playing out on the on screen, and he's really it's really just an expression of his mind already being drunk with power, grandeur of power, and trying to take that mantle for himself. I think that's one way. I mean, that's obviously a very Jungian way of looking at it. I don't. If anyone has followed us for a while, you know that there's a lot of Jungian psychology that we talk about here. So I think that's how the witches function in one way. But then you also have the tragedy of body in how much death and suffering comes from the actions of this one man. And I'd say tragedy of Macbeth focuses on the tragedy of mind. And Justin Kurzel's 2015 Macbeth focuses on the tragedy of body. It's very gritty. There's a lot of death and suffering and blood. So I'm very excited to talk about these two. Also because I didn't know Macbeth 2015 even existed.
It had a really weird release, yeah. So we'll just go through it. Like I said, it was put out in 2015. It had a really limited release in the States.
Yeah, I'd hardly call it even a release. It sounds more like a couple film parties.
It was, it released in 5 theaters. Like I said, very limited. It did terribly. It had a budget of $20 million and made $16 million back. And I think this movie could have really worked. It sort of, I think, like from the trailers, seemed to have a feel of like a Gladiator or a Troy. Like it sort of maybe looked like it was supposed to be kind of a epic war movie, maybe a little more high-minded because it is Shakespeare and it's Macbeth, and so you have to do more than what Gladiator did. But I think this movie could have done well if it had actually gotten a real release. But I do think there are parts of it that make it less approachable because of its still heavy use of Shakespearean dialogue. And so we can move on to a little bit of the stats for Tragedy of Macbeth, which I mentioned came out in 2021. It had a limited release. It was put out by A24, and then it got its kind of like real mainstream release on Apple TV. Because of that, I have no idea what the budget is. I looked all over for any information on that. And during its kind of limited release, it made $45,000. So again...
I was one of those dollars.
Yes.
Actually, I was 7 of those dollars because on Tuesdays, Landmark Theaters do $7 movies.
So you even went for the cheaper ticket?
Yeah. I went with a group, and I didn't know that Landmark did that sort of thing because, you know, I don't like doing things on weekdays because I have like a set order of like, you know, I'm going to go home, I'm going to work out, I'm going to make food, I'm going to watch the movies I need to, maybe play some video games with friends. And like I have a very structured way I like to go about my weeknights, whereas my weekends, it's like, you know, there's time to do fun things.
Yeah, right.
Which I don't know if this is necessarily counts for some people as being a fun thing, but you have to go somewhere.
I do think watching two versions of Macbeth and then talking about them aren't going to rank high on most people's lists, but it did for us. That's why I'm really excited to talk about these.
I mentioned to my sisters that I got to go finish watching Macbeth, and they were like, "Wow, are you in high school again?"
So Joel Cohen directed The Tragedy of Macbeth. It is his first film that he hasn't done with his brother. They had done Fargo, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, No Country for Old Men. So, I mean, they've worked together on some pretty big films. So the fact that he does Tragedy of Macbeth and it's, at least financially, I would call a flop, despite not knowing the budget for it, I assume is not very high. It was shot over 36 days, completely on a soundstage, aside from one exterior shot that's used at the very end of the film. So I imagine this wasn't like overly expensive to make. It also didn't go the Lighthouse route where it filmed in black and white and used, I think, like they tried to use like kind of period accurate photographic means for that. This was shot digitally and then just color corrected to black and white. So there was no expensive, complicated way of producing the film and editing it. This was digital. So
it's still a little complicated on each scene needs to be color corrected because you have different light temperatures and different light amounts. So to color correct it to make it all seem coherent, each one needs to be done. But yeah, overall, it's not like, I don't think there was any CGI here. I think a lot of it was like simple camera tricks. A lot of it feels like old superimpositions and things like that. It's very true to what I would describe as something out of Germanic expressionism in the 1920s.
The one goofy CGI shot is the crow that Denzel Washington is swiping at. I thought it was so janky looking. I thought it would have looked better if you make it look like a crow on like a line, and it just someone's like above the stage, like has it on a fishing pole or something, like tracking it around, and then having it swing out the window. It would have felt more of the aesthetic of the movie, which is meant to look like a stage play. But we'll get more into aesthetic in our part 2 of this kind of compare and contrast. In this one, we wanted to go over comparing and contrasting the characters and their performances. So I say we just move right into Denzel Washington's portrayal of Macbeth. I had a fear when I turned this on that it was going to feel like Denzel Washington just saying lines, and he's so big and so famous that there is no way this wasn't going to sound like Remember the Titans, like he's just giving a speech. And after hearing a couple of the British actors give their lines, and then
Ralph Ineson was in this,
right? Which I was excited for. He's a very small role in this. Mm-hmm. But as soon as I had heard people with accents talking, and then Denzel started, I just was like, "Fuck, this is exactly what I feared." And I don't think he's especially bad in this. And I think the point of this is to feel like a stage play, and he does that. I just think you need to put someone who is going to do an accent, because I don't think Denzel Washington probably wanted to do an accent for this. And I think you could maybe look at it as the director wanted him to stand out. So by not having an accent, you can like kind of partition him off from the rest of the movie in that way. I just still think it doesn't work at all. If everyone else is speaking with that accent and it's supposed to be this old English, it sounds really weird having someone with an American accent deliver Shakespearean dialogue.
Yeah, I think it's funny that you say that. Like, I think that the accents in both of them are actually kind of problematic. It's just that we notice Francis McDormand's and Denzel's mostly because we hear all of the nuances of our accent, whereas we don't notice the nuances between Scottish, between RP, between Irish. I think that you can hear a lot of German in Michael Fassbender's.
Right.
In Marion Cotillard's, you can hear some French. In Jack Rayner playing Macduff, you can hear a lot of Irish. Mm-hmm. Really frustrates me. Like,
right.
Why would you be cast? Like, it's such a small role of her. How many speaking things? We didn't need Jack. It's not like he's a star. Yeah, I mean, he was in Midsummer, but that didn't even come out yet.
Right.
So yeah, I think both of them really on different levels. I didn't really love that. I mean, especially considering how few. For being a Scottish play, how few of these actors are Scottish in both of them.
I want to watch a version of this movie that is all the dialogue is changed to like the way Scottish tweets sound, where you can't understand a goddamn thing anyone's saying. This movie the dialogue in this is already that kind of that way. I think the kind of old English you can understand what they're saying and what they mean, but it's just said in a way that is like still foreign. And so I think you could have done this, yeah, where people are just saying things that don't make any sense the way Scottish people talk now, and that is a very funny version of this movie.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, overall, I would say that I think it's pretty obvious to the tone of the movie which actor portrayed Macbeth better. I think Denzel does a good job, but it feels strange. It feels kind of out of place in that film. And Fassbender just gives an amazing performance in terms of a line delivery, but as well as demonstrating. One review I saw said that Macbeth is such a hard character to play because you have to show this cold, power hungry lord, and also this weak, feeble man whose mind is falling apart, and he somehow is able to play both of those at the same time, and with all the believability of both.
I totally agree. Yeah, I loved Michael Fassbender in this, and I think the way you said, being cold-blooded, but then also having this like struggle internally with him, I guess it was an emphasis by the filmmaker to have him portrayed as someone who was going through like PTSD from the stress of being in a battle, and so he would be conflicted and he would be struggling through this, but still be ruthless enough to kill his best friend, murder Macduff's family, but then also seemed to be coming a part of the seams. I thought Michael Fassbender did a great job in this. Whereas I think Denzel nailed the part of Macbeth in a stage play, but I didn't really get that like conflict inside of him because all of his lines are delivered the same way. I felt I didn't think there was enough change in his tone or cadence to make me feel one part of him is calculated killer, and the other part of him is slowly like coming loose and losing his sense of self and becoming paranoid. They just all felt like the same character all the time.
Yeah, it's interesting how both films played with where they wanted to put the emotion. One put it in the performance and one put it into the set. So we'll talk about that more in aesthetic. But yeah, that's why I think one performance feels transcendent and another one feels like a really good stage play monologue.
Yeah, which is, again, is part of my trouble with this movie. It's like, I think Denzel nailed it. I think what he did is exactly what he's directed to do. I think it's exactly what the character was supposed to be in that film. Mm-hmm. My trouble comes from, I would just go see the play then. I think this, we'll go into it more with aesthetic. I think Tragedy of Macbeth did not take advantage of the medium.
Oh, that's so funny because I feel so strongly opposite to that.
Okay.
But I've had this conversation with a few people now. It's mostly from how much the stages and the lighting and everything really brought out the film nerd fanboy in me. So we'll talk about more of that when we get to aesthetic.
All right, so then I want to move on to Lady Macbeth. I want to start off with Marion Cotillard's portrayal of Lady Macbeth. This is from the Michael Fassbender Macbeth. I think it's really interesting. We talked about accents. They wanted her to keep her French accent to create this sense of otherness, like someone who is in the community but has an agenda outside the community. Ooh. And I think that is shown like almost explicitly, like the way she treats Macbeth. It's like she's not just kind of complicit going along with it. She's an active part of the killing of Duncan and Macbeth's motivation to do that. Mm-hmm. I think when Frances McDormand does it in Tragedy of Macbeth, it's not implied as heavily how involved she is. I think she's playing a role in it, certainly, but I don't think she's as active as Lady Macbeth in the 2015 version. I think they both fit the role of their movie well. I just like the performance and the involvement of Marion Cotillard's version of Macbeth better. It functioned overall better, and I thought it gave more depth to that character, especially just the little nuance of having her have a different accent. I thought that it's so subtle, but kind of subconsciously you know that she is not a part of it, you know?
Yeah. I don't know how you can say that, though, and then cast a German-Irish actor as Macbeth with a slight German accent and not get a sense of otherness from him too. Like, it doesn't stand out from anybody else's otherness then, because you have 4 or 5 different accents. I mean, Sean Harris is English as well, so like you don't have like the only people that are actually Scottish in the 2015 one are a lot of the like the monk guy. He's dressed in that cloak.
Oh, right.
Yeah, there's like 3 of them that are Scottish in that version, and all of them are minor side characters that have a few lines of dialogue, but I don't think that you get that sense of otherness then if everybody sounds other.
I get where you're coming from. I think it's just easy for a lot of Americans to hear most European accents and just clump them all together.
Yeah,
You're
I
like,
agree, but like, why make that decision then?
right.
I think that's a, do you understand like how this is going to land then? You really should have had like Frances McDormand playing that character with a modern day English accent if you really wanted that to be the case of otherness.
Right. Watching this, besides like my fear of how Denzel would sound, I say Denzel like we're buds. I did not expect to be so hung up on accents with both of these movies.
Yeah.
It seems like such a small part, but I mean, we've gone on it as a trait to these characters and elaborated on how we think it works and doesn't work. It was definitely something I wasn't expecting to be like, oh man, like fix this, please, because it's making the movie less coherent in a way, and it's something just so subtle as an accent.
Yeah, I feel like it's something that I don't know, I bring it up a lot in a lot of things that we've talked about, so maybe I'm just wearing off on you.
Yeah,
like,
for sure.
I think if you want something to be, like, I understand you want star power, but you also need to pay attention to like if your point is period accuracy. Like the whole thing of the 2015 is verisimilitude. So if you want everything to feel real, it needs to be real people from the time.
Right.
Like otherwise, then what's the point?
I think you put Robert Eggers behind the camera making this movie.
That's why he's doing The Northman.
Yeah, I think it would be amazing.
I am so excited about that.
I did think about like maybe double back to Macbeth real quick and having someone who I think could have the right accent for it, maybe would fit the role better. It's like Idris Elba, I think could have done the role pretty well.
Are you talking about for tragedy?
Yes.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And like, yeah, I mean, if you wanted to have the star power, then you put like Benedict Cumberbatch in it. I think he could have fit the role. I think just purely having the accent could have made this movie so much better to me. I also thought like Colin Firth, who's like from Kingsman and like The King's Speech.
I love The King's Speech.
Yeah, that's a really good movie. I thought he could have worked well too. Like he's not as physically imposing as Denzel Washington is, but to have like that.
But Idris Elba would be.
Yeah.
My gosh, first of all, visage of a man. Also, like.
Jaden isn't here to complain about it.
Yeah, I know,
He hates
exactly.
him.
Yeah, from his cameo in The Office. But what I love too is that they decided to, you could say something about wokeness or whatever, like of like casting someone someone who's black as the role of Macbeth. But I think it's a fun visual thing to put black skin and white skin in a black and white film. It's a challenge to actually shoot some certain shades of black skin in photography because of the way light reflects off of it.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting and striking example of like how just a person provides a different aesthetic quality. So I like that, like just from a technical standpoint, what it would look like. And I think that it would actually be harder with Idris Elba. I think he's a little bit darker than Denzel, just from like what it would mean to actually light all of those things and color correct them differently.
Yeah, no, I like that idea. Little fun fact, almost all of the costumes were black and white or like shades of gray for the Tragedy of Macbeth. I think apart from some of Frances McDormand's costumes had some color to them. But I kind of like the idea, and then the sets were the same way. They were all like kind of do a grayscale. So I kind of think it's kind of interesting to look at it. It would probably have looked the same if you viewed it on a stage as it does color corrected like in post to make it black and white. I think that's interesting to keep the costumes in a grayscale to kind of add to that atmosphere and feeling of the film.
That's interesting. Yeah, so what do you think of like so Cotillard then obviously is supposed to be othered. What do you think of Frances McDormand's performance then?
Again, I think she fits the tone of it being a play. I think we'll get into some of the dialogue later on, but she delivers it fine. She's not as interesting as the 2015 version, I don't think. Like I said, I don't think she's pushing Macbeth in the same way that other character is. I won't say that I don't like Frances McDormand in this movie. I don't think it's possible to not like Frances McDormand in a movie. She's fantastic. But a lot of the feeling I wanted to get out of it, I didn't get the same way I got from the other portrayal of it. And there's just something about hearing her say "unsex me" in an American accent that just doesn't land. So again, most of my critiques of this film will come from the people who are in it using an American accent. Not necessarily, I don't think the performances are bad. It just, and they seem to fit the tone of the movie. They just didn't capture, I guess, I think Old English needs to be said in a certain way in order for it to land correctly, and they didn't do that.
I don't know if it necessarily needs to be said I think it needs to be consistent with everybody else, because it should be a localized thing, right? Everybody's all in the same country, so you'd imagine that everyone has a relatively similar accent. And so I suppose I could forgive some of the Irish, German, and French accents, because dialects were a little bit more different when the mode of transportation was so limited. But I don't think that you could have them so different the way that they are here.
Yeah, I wonder how this movie would have sounded if it was just all American accents across the board.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that would be more digestible.
I think for cohesion, it certainly makes more sense.
Yeah, exactly.
So I want to talk about Corey Hawkins and his portrayal of Macduff in The Tragedy of Macbeth. You might know him. He was in that NWA movie, Straight Outta Compton. He plays Dr. Dre.
That was terrible.
I know you didn't like it. I like NWA a lot, so I thought it was a fun movie. Maybe it's not the best movie, but I liked it. But it's just really interesting to see him going. He played Dr. Dre not too long ago, and now he's Macduff in a Shakespearean retelling of Macbeth, and I thought it was really neat to see like kind of his range.
Yeah.
One of the problems I have with him in this, and again, I don't know. I have not seen Macbeth on stage. I haven't seen a play. I don't know. I know an approximation of the whole story, but these movies are like my first real experience with Macbeth. So I don't really know kind of the separation and rivalry that should be built between Macbeth and Macduff in regards to the source material. I just think that in Tragedy of Macbeth, they're not at odds enough. If they're going to have this kind of climax at the end, then I think their relationship needs to be, it needs to be more visceral. Like it needs to matter more to me. And I don't think that even the scene of his children being killed and his wife being killed in Tragedy of Macbeth, it still didn't land enough for me to understand the hate that he would have. And I wonder, what did you think of Corey Hawkins as this character? Yeah,
it's interesting that you say that. There's actually some speculation that Macbeth the version that we have is actually an abridged version. It's about 1,000 lines shorter than King Lear, I think, and about half as long as Hamlet. So there is some scholarly discussion that the version that we have is not the true version of Macbeth. So I think that could be I feel that actually is similar in both films. I think that the rivalry of Macduff is not really well established as to why he killed either of their families. Why he went after Macduff's in the Fassbender one is just as confusing to me as in Tragedy, and why they ultimately fight in the end, I don't know. So I also didn't watch these with subtitles, just so you know. These were the few movies that I didn't watch with subtitles, because I wanted to see. I had an understanding of what the story was. I wanted to see how the visual elements of these films worked, and so I just focused on those and not necessarily the narrative elements.
Yeah, which I did the opposite, and I've said on this podcast a bunch of times, I hate watching movies with subtitles, but I knew that this kind of language was going to be easier for me to digest and understand. I can hear the character say, my mind is full of scorpions. I know what that means, but I needed the extra cue of reading it to really comprehend it. And so I definitely watched this with subtitles. I think it helped me make the story more cohesive, and I did it for both films. I think for me, they both needed it. But I do like your idea of can I just soak up what's on screen and have this make sense to me? Mm-hmm. I think that's an interesting way to take it. I think it's funny it's kind of switched our position on it because I hate subtitles. So let's keep talking about Macduff and Sean Harris's portrayal of the character in the 2015 Macbeth. I loved him in this. We talked about him a little while ago when we did our review on Green Knight, and he's playing King Arthur in that, and how I think we had usually seen him as like a villain character in the Mission Impossible movies.
That was actually my first time seeing him was in The Green Knight, because I don't
Oh.
think I've ever seen a Mission Impossible movie, nor do I ever wish to.
Okay.
So just to let you know, that's not upcoming on this podcast.
Right. Those are such a spectacle. But
Yeah.
I don't think they're very fun to talk about.
I don't
They're all
need
the
more
same movie.
Yeah, exactly. Like I'm not in like I didn't go to film school where we did like action stunts and where we did all of these big set pieces. I scratched images on exposed film stock in a dark room by myself.
All right. Yeah, I thought Sean Harris was great in this. I thought he brought so much emotion to the character. I loved the scene where he discovers that Duncan's been killed, and he just yells for everyone to wake. And he's just completely broken by the loss of his king. And the part where Macbeth is now the king, they're in the courtyard or the courtroom together having a banquet, and it's clear that Macbeth is starting to kind of lose it, and Macduff leaves. It's kind of this like he's decided that he's going to have this separation, and he's going to try and I think that's the beginning of his plot to dethrone Macbeth. And then you have I think is a tragic scene of the burning of his wife and children, which is a scene I didn't think landed at all in Tragedy of Macbeth, but I really felt something going through that scene in Macbeth. And then Sean Harris's reaction to that, Macduff falling to his knees, holding Malcolm, like vowing that he's going to like have vengeance on Macbeth. I thought Sean Harris was fantastic in this. I think he should be in way more movies. I thought he was awesome. What did you think of Macduff in Macbeth? Yeah,
and I think I should also mention the fact that, before I said that Tragedy of Macbeth is more of a tragedy of the mind and the Fassbender one is more a tragedy of body. That's not to say that there aren't a lot of elements here that are deeply tragic to the mind of pain, of suffering, of Fassbender's mind deteriorating. There are some deeply, I'd say there's more emotion from the actors in the Fassbender one, and that's just one of those scenes where it's just like heartbreaking. Like even though you didn't know his family, there wasn't a lot of like relationship that those relationships weren't really built up. We're just assuming like you love your kids, love your wife, blah blah blah, that type of thing. But how much of himself he put into that scene just really carried it. Like even if you don't understand what he's saying, there's so much body dialogue going on there that's not present in tragedy that really conveys everything that you need to know.
I like to think of his character as just like this raw nerve. Just like every time something touches it, like you feel it. Mm-hmm. Like I can't praise Sean Harris enough in this movie. It's really sad to me that this didn't get a very good release in the US because I think there's some really good performances in it.
Yeah, exactly. And it's weird that it didn't, because I mean, look at the star power that was in it.
Oh yeah, I mean, Marion Cotillard had just done one of the Batman movies, so I mean, she was known enough. Michael Fassbender is pretty huge in the US after all the X-Men movies.
Yeah, and I think after this he did Assassin's Creed.
With the same director.
Yeah, with the same director, which is just... And I think Marion Cotillard was in that as well. Yeah, they just decided like, well, last one was a critical failure, or it was a monetary failure. Let's try again.
Yeah. Let's go for round 2. I want to talk just a little fun fact about the X-Men relationship to Macbeth.
Huh.
Michael Fassbender's the 4th member of the X-Men cast to play Macbeth either on stage or on film.
Okay, obviously Patrick Stewart.
Yes.
You mean the titular character?
Yes, to play Macbeth. Too.
Yeah. Lindsey Graham. Fraser. What's Fraser's name?
Isn't it Lindsey Graham?
No, that can't be it, because that's the senator. Kelsey Grammer.
Kelsey Grammer. Golly.
Yeah.
But no, it's not Kelsey Grammer.
No, come on. He has to. He has to have been in Macbeth.
I don't know. Maybe he didn't play Macbeth. But the other one is Ian McKellen, who is Magneto in X-Men.
Yeah, but what is he in?
He played Macbeth in the stage play.
Oh, I don't know why I was thinking only in these movies.
And then you have James McAvoy, who played Professor X, and he also played Macbeth in a stage play.
No, check this out. Kelsey Grammer did play Macbeth on an ill-received Broadway revival of Shakespeare's Macbeth that ran for 10 days.
And he's an X-Men?
Yeah, Kelsey Grammer is the blue beast guy.
Oh my God, you're so right.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's 5 characters who appeared in X-Men.
I had to, like, Kelsey Grammer just feels like a titan of stage presence. He has to have been Macbeth at some point.
No, I'm glad you looked it up.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I guess his Macbeth was just so bad that he didn't get a nod for even Wikipedia.
I'm saying if we've learned anything, it's that if you were in X-Men, you will go on to play Macbeth at some point. Or if you played Macbeth, you will go on to be in an X-Men movie.
Yeah, I'm not sure which one I would rather one to portend.
So let's move on to Banquo. I like how he's set up in the story. It's like the witches tell Macbeth that Banquo's children will become kings after him because Macbeth doesn't have any heirs, and that leads to the kind of distrust and eventual murder of his friend Banquo. Like Macbeth sends assassins out to kill him. And while I don't think either of these actors gave like particularly great performances, I don't think either of them were bad. Bertie Carvel plays Banquo in the Tragedy of Macbeth, and I think he's utterly forgettable except for his eyebrows are off the chain. They're so huge. But again, they have a role to play in the story, and that's all they are.
Yeah, they're just devices. Because it's also strange. Like, part of the tragedy is, like, literally that prophecy has nothing to do with Macbeth. You know, Macbeth can live until he's 80, then die, and then someone else becomes king. It doesn't mean that he's not going to be king for the rest of his life.
Right. I do want to point out Lachlan Harris plays Fleance in Macbeth, the 2015 Michael Fassbender Macbeth. And he gives the most convincing I just saw my parents die cry I have ever seen in a movie. It's a trope that I think comes in and out of films like pretty often. I mean, we've seen Bruce Wayne do it like 5 times on film now.
Too many, one might argue.
Yes, I agree. He's got a lot of work to do, that young Bruce Wayne, because this kid I thought his face is so tragic and it felt so real in that moment. I've never seen a kid emote that way on screen. I thought it was fantastic. And is really kind of the highlight to that scene and kind of the end of Banquo. But we're going to get more into that later. I just wanted to point him out. I thought he was fantastic in the limited part he plays. I thought it was some of the best child acting I've seen, some of the best child emoting I'd seen on screen ever.
Yeah. Well, I'd say that Seamus Scrimshaw is probably the best one that I've ever seen. He played the boy in The Witch.
Yeah, he's really good too.
I'm pretty sure it's Seamus Scrimshaw. I'm almost positive it's Scrimshaw because I remember thinking like, oh, Scrimshaw trinket.
Yep.
Like,
you said that exact same thing when we recorded that podcast.
No, it's Harvey Scrimshaw. Harvey Scrimshaw is the probably the best child acting I've ever seen.
A good in-podcast correction. That way our tens of fans don't come after us later. I want to talk about the witches now because I think they're both really good in like isolated to their own film. They're one of the few things that I think I really enjoyed equally in both of them. I think I tend to, just in kind of the critique I've given so far, I obviously lean more towards the Fassbender version of this as being the one that I liked more. But I thought the witches worked so well in both of their versions. And I want to know, let's start off with Kathryn Hunter. She plays the witches in Tragedy of Macbeth.
Yeah, absolutely amazing, because I think there's a supernatural quality that you really need to capture with Macbeth, and it all comes from the witches, because it's this cosmic game of fate, or it's a play of the mind, one of those two things. But either way, they really need to be they really need to feel otherworldly, and that's posture, face, the way they emote, like all of those things just say something is very, very different here. What a cool decision to go with one character playing all 3 of them.
Right.
I think that was a smart choice, because it creates another level of unease. Like, why do they all look the same? They could just not be human, but portrayals of what someone would consider to be human.
I love the way she's introduced on the beach. And it's kind of the first, and I think only scene that I think kind of tries to engage with the audience. I love that when she's speaking, she turns her head, and then the camera she'll be looking towards the camera again, almost like she's talking to you, but she's also talking to the other witches in that same moment. So I loved the kind of play with the camera there. It's a technique that I don't think is used ever again in the movie. But I really liked her introduction. It felt different from the rest of the movie. And again, I think it added to that otherworldly quality. I think if you play with where the camera's moving, instead of having it kind of static like a lot of the shots are in Tragedy of Macbeth, I like that it was the way it was edited and the way it was moving. I also really loved just visually the scene of her standing in front of that puddle, and you see the reflection of the two other witches in it.
Yeah.
Just visually, it was a very cool shot. It's one of the few like visually interesting shots I think I pulled from Tragedy of Macbeth.
It's fascinating because I think every shot is visually interesting in Tragedy of Macbeth.
When we get into the aesthetic, that's where the fireworks are going to fly. We disagree, I think.
And it's all going to be in black and white, all of the fireworks.
But I loved her voice. I loved her cadence. The boil, boil, toil and trouble line I thought was, it leapt out at me. She's just, I think, the perfect casting for it. I don't know that I've seen her in anything else, but I think she nailed this role.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, what a casting in a film that was my main problem with.
Right. So let's move on to the witches in Macbeth. Apparently, the director Justin Kurzel liked the 7-year-old actress Amber Risman so much that he ended up just casting her as a fourth witch, because the story is just originally 3 witches. And I guess she had one line of dialogue that got cut anyways, so she's just there as kind of a visual element. He just thought that she worked so well on screen that he was like, you know what, I'm adding a fourth witch. So I think this movie kind of departs from some of the traditional tellings of Macbeth, and I don't think that's a bad one. Again, I think the witches function really well in this. I love how they're always like shrouded in fog, and there's a lot of some of the color palette that has them like, it has this green tint to it, and it just gives this sense of unease. And when you use green on to tint your scene, it gives like this feel of like it's gross, it's unnatural. The same in a different way where like having blue would imply that it's cold and like dark. Mm-hmm. And so I love the way like kind of the palette is and the environment that the witches are in the 2015 Macbeth.
So I like the environment that they're in. I like the way that they're. No, I don't like the way that they're shot. I don't really like them at all. Just I like the fog. The thing is like, the way that they're sitting and acting, they seem to be doing like human things. And that I think is takes away from what we were talking about, like the cosmic tragedy of fate. Like when he revisits them, they're all just like sitting around like women. And the fact that one of them is holding the baby, like his child, I think is strongly suggested from the beginning of the film that when she dies, the witches take her. Mm-hmm. Or him, I'm not sure actually now, but it doesn't really matter. Like it paints a different picture of them. It makes them feel human. It makes them feel domicile. It makes them feel gendered in a way that makes them feel less threatening. I don't love that for that reason. Like, I think they needed to be played a little bit differently. Fewer lines of dialogue, maybe. Just make them like if you're gonna change stuff, just make them a foreboding image. Like there's just women standing on a battlefield. I think that's kind of all you really need to know. And then maybe have like an inner dialogue of himself talking about how he's going to be king, that sort of thing. I don't know. I don't think that they were incorporated very well into this version, because this version is so much about verisimilitude that. How do you have real witches that aren't really doing anything? You know, they should have been doing something.
I thought it was kind of conveyed enough in like the scarring some of them have, and it looked like they had. I don't know,
yeah, I get like they look like witches, but like they don't feel like witches.
I guess maybe I just got enough about like enough was interpreted to me in the visual language of how they were presented that I got the mystical feel of them. I think that's kind of one of the parts of that movie that I like. I think the imagery is really powerful in it, and I love the palette and how the camera functions in it, and a lot of the shots you're getting out of it. So maybe I just thought the way they function in the movie seemed to fit the aesthetic of that film, and that's my praise for both of the versions of the witches we get. Is I think they just work really well in each of their films. I totally understand what you're saying. I think you probably could have pumped them up more. But I just think they exist visually in such a cool way that I didn't really need them to be doing anything kind of mystical or creepy the same way I think you needed the witch in Tragedy of Macbeth to act maybe kind of over the top to really convey that sense of otherworldliness. All right, so we've gone through these characters, which I think was what we wanted to do for the first part of this review and discussion. We'll cover aesthetic, the sound, and kind of compare and contrast some of the scenes in part 2. But with that, we're going to wrap this one up. I just want to thank Calvin, as always, for being on.
Oh, thanks for having me.
And you can find our podcast on any platform like Spotify or Apple Music. We also upload all these to YouTube. So go ahead and leave a comment. Tell us what we're doing well. Tell us what we're doing wrong. And if you have any suggestions for movies we should do in the future, we'd love to hear them. And with that, thank you for listening to Now This Is Podcasting.